Imagine being so terrified of your political opponents that you publish a panic-stricken article in The Guardian, essentially screaming that your party has no plan, is caught like a deer in headlights, and is facing an existential threat that could destroy democracy itself if left unchallenged. That's the extraordinary admission we're seeing from Sir Chris Powell, a new Labour strategist who helped Tony Blair win his 1997 landslide, who's now sounding the alarm that Keir Starmer's Labour has absolutely no strategy to deal with Nigel Farage's Reform UK. And the numbers backing up his panic are genuinely shocking. According to Politico's poll of polls, Reform is in first place at 29%, crushing the Conservatives on 18%, with Labour tied with the Greens at a humiliating 16%. That means a party that won a landslide election less than 2 years ago is now polling third, tied with the Greens, while the insurgent party everyone dismissed as a flash in the pan is leading by double digits. Powell's prescription is desperate establishment playing, calling for no-holds-barred thinking and a semi-autonomous digital narrative unit to wage online war, while Reform MP Lee Anderson is laughing all the way to the ballot box, saying the attacks are backfiring big time and the lefties are petrified. So buckle up, because we're diving into what these catastrophic polling numbers mean, why establishment panic is arguably helping Reform rather than hurting them, whether there's any realistic strategy Labour could deploy that wouldn't make things worse, and what it says about British democracy that the party warning about threats to democracy is the one losing so spectacularly. This is UK Political Insight, and honestly, watching the establishment melt down in real time is both fascinating and terrifying. Let's start with those poll numbers, because they're genuinely historic and deserve to be repeated for emphasis. Reform UK is polling at 29%, first place, nearly 3 in 10 voters saying they'd back Nigel Farage's party. The Conservatives, the traditional party of the right that's been a pillar of British politics for centuries, are at 18%. That's an 11-point gap, which in political terms is a chasm. But here's where it gets truly wild. Labour, the party that won a 174-seat landslide victory less than 2 years ago, the party currently governing with a massive majority, is polling at 16%, tied with the Green Party. Let that sink in for a moment. The governing party, barely 18 months into their term, is polling third, level with a party that's traditionally been a fringe player getting single-digit support. That's not just bad, that's apocalyptic. The Liberal Democrats are at 13%, which is actually relatively respectable given the chaos everyone else is experiencing. But the real story is Reform's dominance and Labour's collapse. We've covered extensively on this channel why Labour's become historically unpopular. The broken promises, the -66 approval ratings, the policies targeting pensioners and farmers, the perception that Starmer lied his way into power. But seeing it crystallized in these polling numbers, seeing Reform not just competitive but actually leading by massive margins, that's when theory becomes reality. These aren't outlier polls from partisan organizations. This is Politico's poll of polls, aggregating multiple surveys. This is the consensus view of where British politics stands right now. Sir Chris Powell's warning in The Guardian is remarkable not for what he's proposing, which is mostly establishment panic dressed up as strategy, but for what he's admitting. He writes, "We are at a very dangerous moment. We simply cannot afford to allow Nigel Farage's Reform UK to have a free run and become established and entrenched as a credible potential government in the minds of disenchanted voters." Read that carefully. He's saying Reform is becoming established as a credible potential government. That's an extraordinary concession from a new Labour strategist. He's not dismissing Reform as cranks or extremists who will never achieve power. He's acknowledging they're becoming a genuine government in waiting in voters' minds. That's the kind of admission you make when you're genuinely terrified. He continues, "The longer they go unchallenged, the more unthreatening and risk-free they will seem to voters. Just hoping that Reform and Farage implode or that the right-wing vote will somehow fracture is potentially suicidal for our freedom and democracy." That second sentence is crucial because it reveals the establishment's previous strategy, which was essentially hoping Reform would destroy itself, hoping Farage would say something so outrageous that voters abandoned him, hoping internal divisions would tear the party apart, hoping the Conservative-Reform split would remain permanent, fracturing the right-wing vote enough that Labour could win by default. Powell's saying that strategy has failed, that hoping isn't working, and continuing to hope is potentially suicidal for our freedom and democracy. Now, let's talk about that phrase, "for our freedom and democracy," because it's revealing in ways Powell probably didn't intend. When establishment figures warn that their opponents winning elections would threaten democracy, what they're really saying is we should be in power and anyone else winning is illegitimate. That's not democratic thinking. Democracy means accepting that sometimes parties and politicians you despise will win because that's what voters want. If reform wins fairly, that's democracy working, not democracy being threatened. You can argue their policies would be bad, that their approach would damage Britain, that they're wrong about everything, but framing democratic election results as threats to democracy itself is authoritarian logic dressed up in democratic language. Powell's prescription for how labor should respond is a masterclass in establishment panic. He says Starmer needs to fundamentally change the way he approaches voters and his way of interacting with them. Well, yes, we could have told you that. Voters feel ignored because they are ignored. They were promised things during the election that were immediately abandoned. They were told taxes wouldn't rise, and then taxes rose. They were promised change and got more of the same. Acknowledging that voters are angry doesn't help if you're not willing to address why they're angry or admit your role in making them angry. Then he calls for labor to create a semi-autonomous digital narrative unit whose sole mission is to wage and win the daily war for attention to take on reform online. Let's just pause and appreciate how dystopian that sounds. A semi-autonomous digital narrative unit. That's Orwellian language for a propaganda operation. He's not calling for better policies that would actually improve people's lives and win back support honestly. He's calling for sophisticated online manipulation to manufacture narratives and fight information wars. That's not democratic politics. That's information warfare. And voters aren't stupid. They can tell when they're being manipulated and they resent it. If anything, creating an obvious propaganda unit would probably drive more people toward reform. Powell's warning that labor is caught in the headlights as its populist opponent expertly reacts to voter pain and disenchantment is accidentally revealing because it acknowledges reform is responding to real concerns while implying labor is frozen and unable to respond. Why is labor unable to respond? Because their entire governing philosophy and policy approach is what's causing the pain and disenchantment. You can't solve a problem you're actively creating. Reform can promise to do things differently because they're not in power and not responsible for current failures. Labor is stuck defending policies nobody likes while trying to explain why broken promises were necessary. That's an unwinnable position. The call for no-holds-barred thinking sounds dramatic until you realize Powell doesn't actually have any bold ideas beyond creating a propaganda unit and hoping Starmer becomes a better communicator. He says labor needs a comprehensive action plan, now. Time is a luxury it can't afford. But a comprehensive action plan to do what? He doesn't specify. Change policies to be less unpopular? That would mean admitting current policies are wrong. Attack reform more aggressively? That's already happening and clearly isn't working. Actually deliver improvements to people's lives? That takes time and resources labor doesn't seem to have or know how to deploy. So the comprehensive action plan is really just panic harder but more strategically. Lee Anderson's response is absolutely perfect from reform's perspective because he's not just dismissing the attacks, he's using them as evidence that reform is winning. He says the lefties are petrified. The more smears and lies they throw at us, the stronger Reform UK gets. It's backfiring big time. That's classic populist judo, using your opponent's attacks as proof that you're the threat they fear, that you represent real change they're desperate to stop. Every establishment panic piece like Powell's article becomes recruitment material for reform, evidence that the out-of-touch elites are terrified of the insurgent movement threatening their power. Anderson continues, they simply can't get their head around calling everyone they disagree with a racist or a fascist doesn't work. And he's absolutely right about this. For years, the establishment response to insurgent right-wing movements has been to label them racist, fascist, extremist, dangerous. Sometimes those labels are accurate, sometimes they're not. But either way, they've been deployed so often and so broadly that they've lost their power.
When you call everyone you disagree with on immigration a racist, when you call everyone who votes for reform a fascist, people stop taking those accusations seriously. The labels get devalued through overuse, and actual dangerous extremism becomes harder to identify and combat because the language has been exhausted on ordinary political disagreement. His point that reform's surge is down to decades of betrayal by his Labour Party and the Conservatives identifies the real issue that establishment panic pieces like Powell's can't address. Voters aren't flocking to reform because they've been manipulated by clever online messaging or because they're fascists who hate democracy. They're supporting reform because mainstream parties have failed them for decades. Wages stagnated while living costs soared, public services deteriorated while taxes increased, immigration policy satisfied nobody, Brexit was promised and then sort of half-delivered in ways that pleased no one. Working-class communities were ignored while metropolitan elites prospered. That's not populist propaganda, that's documented reality. Anderson finishes with, "The British public are sick to death of being lectured by these out-of-touch elites who have destroyed this country."